Welcome back to the Pursuit Zone. I'm Paul Schmid, the host of this podcast that interviews explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 184 with Alice Bowers. In this episode, we talk about cycling in Australia, cycling from Indonesia to Nepal, packrafting Bangladesh, and hiking in Iceland. But before we start the show, I want to play a voicemail I got from a listener in Brighton, England.
Hello, Paul. My name is Chris Kelly. I'm 39 years old and I'm from England. I discovered your podcast a few days ago, starting, I think it might have been 183, with the chap who hiked across Labrador and Newfoundland with his dog called Saku. That's the first of your podcasts I discovered, and I absolutely loved it. It is everything I am looking for. It crosses the boundaries between entertainment and self-help and motivation. Absolutely wonderful. So imagine my joy when I saw it. It was episode 180-something. I am quickly going through all the previous episodes. I absolutely love your podcast. Rather than sending an email, I've heard this message about Speakpipe at the end of your pod, so I thought I'd leave you something more personal. Thank you very much. I would say keep up the good work, but you've done lots of the good work, so I'm going to enjoy the good work you've been doing. Thank you very much, and all the best to you, and thank you for covering up the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That message made my day. I really appreciate it. And now, let's get into the show, and let me introduce Alice. She had an ordinary life as a geography teacher before setting out to live a life of adventure. She is passionate about traveling and human-powered exploration, and spent 13 months cycling the length of Australia and New Zealand, and then from Indonesia to Nepal. The journey opened her eyes to the kindness of strangers, but also to the harmful effects humans have on the environment. She also spent a month paddling the rivers of rural Bangladesh and recently returned home from walking the length of Iceland. You can learn more at her website, alicebowers.com. Alice Bowers, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thanks for having me.
Alice, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Southport, which is a town of about 100,000 people on the coast of northwest England. It's mainly a retirement town, so I reckon about 40% of the people there are over 60 years old. It was all right to grow up. It wasn't so bad. Didn't have a huge amount of things to do, I don't think, for like young people.
And did you go to university?
Yeah, I did. So I went to university in North Wales in Bangor, and I did geography, which was awesome because you had like the mountains right on your doorstep and the ocean, like it was like a 5-10 minute walk to get to the sea. It was really, really beautiful.
Was your plan when you started the degree to become a teacher?
Yep. And my original application for university, it said that I wanted to be a geography teacher from the age of about 14. That's all I'd really wanted to do. So when I graduated, I had a gap year doing some random jobs, and then started teacher training, and then did a few years of teaching.
What made you want to give that up to go cycling?
So I'd been reading a lot of adventure-based books, and I'd got a job in an all right school. I'd just moved in with a boyfriend who was really nice. And I had a moment where I was 24 years old, and I kind of had a realization that was probably the rest of my life. I could predict that I'd probably maybe get married, buy a house together, be a teacher for the next 50 years. And the idea of doing that same thing day in, day out for the next foreseeable future absolutely terrified me. So I handed in my notice, broke up with my boyfriend, moved out the shared house, and decided to go on a long bike ride.
Did you already have the bike at this point?
Yeah, so I'd got my bike to cycle to work. Getting the bike's a little bit of a funny story. So obviously I had to save up to go cycle touring. But when I originally bought my bike, I went to the bike shop because I was going to pay it on a monthly payment plan. I've got a Surly long haul trucker. And my card was cancelled. It didn't accept my card because my credit history was so bad, so I couldn't buy a bike on my own card. So I had to phone my mum and ask my mum to put it onto her card so that I could transfer the money every month. And then a year later, I'd saved up about £7,000 to go cycling, which is quite a big, it's quite a big difference. So I got a lot better at saving once I'd bought the bike.
Then your plan was, after you saved up this money, was to go to Australia, right? You wanted to start Australia first because I think the idea was get the working holiday visa so that therefore, if you needed to, you could make some money while you were there. Is that true?
Yeah, so I'd already worked for Oxfam in the UK, and I knew that they had a team in Sydney. So I knew that when I got to Australia, I could get work there as well. The original plan was to cycle from Australia back to the UK, but I ended up working for a year in Sydney altogether, like on off. So that changed things a little bit. And in the end, I did Australia to Nepal, and then decided that that was good enough for me at the moment. But yeah, the plan was I got a working holiday visa, went to Sydney, was in Australia for a year, and then the company Oxfam that I was working for sponsored me for an extra 6 months so that I could stay there for a bit longer, which was cool.
I want to hear the story a little bit about getting your gear, because I think you got it all from eBay. How did that work out?
Perfect. Like, I did a load of research on what gear I wanted, what really good gear I wanted, and then went on eBay, got it all secondhand. All of it was absolutely amazing, worked really, really well. I didn't really do any practicing with any of my gear, so kind of learn on the way. The first night I had a Dragonfly MSR stove, and the first night that I tried to use it in Tassie, I nearly set fire to my own head. So I didn't realise quite how much like fire was going to come out of it. But the good news was, after nearly setting fire to my own head, the camper van next door to me, the woman realised that I was probably struggling a little bit and brought over a glass of Prosecco for me to drink with my dinner. So that was quite a nice way to start out, really. And then I figured out how to use the stove.
And you went to Australia with no route planning in mind, or you didn't do any route planning. So when you flew into Melbourne, and then what happens? How do you decide? Do you work right away, or do you start cycling?
So I flew into Melbourne, stayed with friends of friends for a couple of nights, decided I would go to Tassie, took the ferry to Tassie, spent 2-3 weeks cycling in Tassie, took the ferry back to Melbourne, cycled to Sydney. So that was about 6.5 weeks altogether. And then I decided to work for a couple of months before flying out to New Zealand. So New Zealand had never even been in the plan originally. But then once I got to Australia, I was like, oh, New Zealand's really close and it's meant to be amazing for cycling. So might as well go there for a few weeks. So I went there for 6 weeks and then returned back to Sydney to do a little bit more work, and then cycled from Sydney to Adelaide to Darwin, which took about 4 months, 4 months. That was amazing. That was really cool.
What was Tasmania like?
Tasmania was absolutely stunning. It's hard to describe. There wasn't very many people there. The nature was incredible. The cycling was really good because you had some really nice hill climbs, but also amazing descents. And you could pretty much wild camp wherever you wanted because there was nobody about. So as long as you were in a bush, nobody would ever know that you were there. I did cry on my first day because I got a puncture. And I'd done a little bit of cycle touring before, but not a huge amount. And I remember that I really struggled to fix this puncture, and it was at the top of a really high hill climb. And I think I just got a bit overwhelmed, like, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Had a little cry and then carried on cycling and was fine for the rest of the day. Yeah, Tassie was brilliant. Loved it. I would definitely go back to Tasmania.
You make your way over to Adelaide and then you cycle up through the center to Darwin. Tell me about that experience.
So when I was in Tassie, I met a guy that had just on the ferry. I met a guy that had just finished cycling from Darwin to Adelaide to Melbourne. And originally I'd thought that it was a bit too dangerous to cycle through the middle because there wasn't enough like water stops and I wasn't that experienced. And then after thinking it over for a while, I decided that I was just going to go for it. It was really, really amazing. People like told me to worry about road trains, which are the massive, massive vehicles, but they weren't a problem. Like, people were amazing. They'd like stop their cars, give you water out of the windows. One guy in a service station, he saw that I was a girl that by myself, thought I was absolutely bonkers because he drives big lorries up and down that road most of the time, and gave me like a high-vis jacket. And then when I unwrapped the high-vis jacket, he'd given me a knife with like a 6-inch blade in it just in case something happened to me. And I remember thinking like, wow, I had like, it kind of reinforced my own faith in people, but also made me think like, what does he actually think is going to happen to me? Like, there's no people around here, even if it was a problem. But yeah, there was some really interesting characters on that road because it's just people that live in the middle of nowhere. I think the longest I didn't see people for, I ended up taking a few back roads. I didn't see people for like a couple of days on some of the back roads. And that was because the roads were technically shut because it had rained so much. And they were some of the most amazing times I had, was when it was just pure desert either side and a single dirt track. And you were just cycling and occasionally talking to myself and imagining friends from home with me on the ride that I would have a full-on conversation with, which probably sounds like I'd gone a bit mad. But yeah, that was really, really amazing. It was beautiful.
Did you end up using the knife?
No, not at all. I met another guy who was cycle touring, who was about 22 years old, and told him this story. And he was like, oh my goodness, I want it. And I was like, yeah, you can have it. I'm not going to use it. So he ended up getting it as a present instead. And I think he was quite happy with it.
These characters that you met along the way, did any of them invite you in to stay with them?
Oh yeah, loads of people invited me in. I remember there was a few days where I'd not booked any accommodation. Like the entire time I was in Australia and New Zealand, I think I paid twice. And both of the times that I paid, it was campsites. There was one day where I got to a pub and it was in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, went to the bar staff and I was like, do you mind if I camp in the pub's back garden? Like, because I don't really want to sleep out rough tonight and I'd quite like a drink. So I ended up having a couple of pints there. And then they said that they had a spare room that no one was using and they let me stay in the hotel for free. And then the next night I was cycling along and maybe I was cycling a bit too far into the road. And it was about 6-7 o'clock and it was getting dark. And this like van pulled over and it was a farmer and he had a bit of a go at me at the fact that I was like so far into the road. And then after like a minute of like telling me off, he was like, where are you planning on sleeping tonight? And I was like, I'm just going to sleep out somewhere out here. And he's like, well, I've got a farm like 5k down the road on the right. So if you want, you can stay with me. And I ended up staying with him. And it turned out that he was a Reiki healer and a farmer. And he had a son who was quite autistic and his son was practicing to be a Buddhist monk. And I was like, this is bizarre, but also the best thing ever. And they made me bacon sandwiches in the morning. And then the night after that, another guy just randomly was like, where are you sleeping tonight? Ended up staying at his house. And then the night after that, someone that I'd met like 3 days before had put me in touch with a family. And I stayed with that family for like 4 or 5 nights altogether. And they were amazing. I remember I ended up playing quite a lot of Monopoly with their kids. It was great.
You know it's going to be a good day when it starts with a bacon sandwich.
Oh, every day with a bacon sandwich is a good day, apart from for the pig.
Well, what do you see out there when you're cycling through the middle of Australia for wildlife?
Saw a couple of snakes. One day I woke up and there was a rather large spider on my back pannier, which did scare me. But it was okay. Got a stick, flaked it off. Everything was good. A lot of kangaroos, camels, wild camels. They were really cool. Wild horses. That was nice. They were like right in the centre. Didn't see a koala, which I'm a little bit disappointed about, but can't have everything in life. And other than that, there were no big creepy crawlies or anything that terrified me. It was mainly just like every so often you'd see something amazing like a wild camel. And that will be the rest of the day, just massive positive.
Did you run into, I've read so many blogs, I get them confused. First of all, thank you, by the way, for having a blog. I really enjoy reading blogs. It seems like not as many people do blogs nowadays. But was it your blog that I was reading where you ran into some sort of film production and then you met a camel wrangler or something? Yeah,
so there was... It had been a really bad storm that day. It had been like thunder and lightning in the middle of the desert. And eventually I'd got to a like outback pub that had a campsite attached to it. And I stayed there. Well, I didn't end up staying there, but when I got in, I was absolutely soaking wet. There was this whole film crew. They were all wearing they all looked like cowboys. And I went over and they were like, what are you doing? Because I looked an absolute mess. And got talking to them and it turned out that they were living at a camel farm, and they were all camel wranglers maybe. They were doing like a big film about the original discovery of, they were trying to find lost gold in Australia or something in the middle of the desert. They were following an original journey and they were making a documentary about it. But then one of the girls that was there was like, tell you what, when you get to not Alice Springs, when you get to Uluru and there's a tiny little there's basically a tourist set up near Uluru, and there was a camel farm there, a working camel farm. She was like, you can stay with me. So I ended up staying with her in a caravan for 2 nights, and I got a free camel ride past Uluru, which was really good. And one of the camels was named Alice, and she gave me a key ring with a picture of Alice the camel on it. so that when I went away, I wouldn't forget them, which was really nice. It was quite nice just to have a friend, and it felt like we'd been friends for ages, because I remember we ended up watching like adventure films in her caravan for like the evening and having pizza and just having like a proper girly night, which was just what I needed.
So you finish up your time in Australia and then you make your way to Indonesia. How do you get over to Indonesia?
When I finished cycling in Darwin, went back to Sydney and I worked for 6 months, took my bike on the plane, and then flew from Sydney to Indonesia to Bali with my bike, and then had a couple of nights just chilling in Bali before starting cycling again. But I hadn't cycled properly for like 6 whole months, so my fitness was pretty poor. So it was a little bit like being thrown into the deep end, so to say.
So you go to Indonesia, which I think was your first sort of non-English speaking country that you were cycling in. Were you pretty confident at this point in your cycle touring abilities?
I was like fairly confident that I could do it, because I knew that I'd done it before. So if I was having a bit of a hard day, I'd be like, it's okay, because remember I had that hard day in Tasmania with the massive hills and I managed that, so I can manage this today. But I think because I'd always been able to speak to people, so in Australia I ended up staying with loads and loads of strangers just because I'd have a chat with them in a supermarket car park or something, and they'd invite me back to their house. So it was I felt a little bit on edge when I first arrived, because I knew that I wouldn't be able to speak to everyone that I wanted to. Part of the trip that I loved in Australia and New Zealand was that I met so many people and got like really amazing life stories from them. And I knew that I wouldn't necessarily have that same experience when I got to Indonesia. But it was a completely different experience. They're 2 completely different trips.
Now my geography skills are gonna hurt me now. So you're on the island of Bali, right? And then so you take a ferry over to Java?
First of all, I went to Lombok, cycled a bit in Lombok, the biggest hill climb I've ever done. And it was ridiculously steep, and then it decided to rain, so it's a little bit scary. And then went back to Bali, ended up having a root canal in Bali because I'd like damaged one of my teeth, which was ridiculously cheap. Highly recommend dental treatment abroad. And then ended up going Bali to Java, Java to Sumatra. I took little ferries in between.
What was Java like?
Java was probably the hardest place I'd ever cycled. When I arrived, I was really excited because I'd been in Bali and Lombok, but Bali and Lombok are really touristy. So I was really, really excited to like get to know the real Indonesia. And then when I got to Java, there was so many people. The roads were really, really busy. It wasn't necessarily that beautiful, and I couldn't speak to people properly. And the hills were insane. Like, they don't do switchbacks. It's just like straight up, straight down on a fairly busy road. Even the smaller roads could be quite busy. So that was probably, I think those 2 weeks in Java were the hardest weeks cycle touring I ever had, because it was like a proper mental test.
And your phone got stolen?
Yeah, my phone got stolen, so I was using it for Google Maps on the side of the road. Just 2 teenagers on the back of a scooter just went past, took it out of my hands. Nothing bad actually happened, but I remember that I tried to like chase them on my bike, and I did a pretty good job of it because there was like a fair amount of traffic. I managed to keep up with them for like at least a couple of kilometres, and then eventually I just stopped at like a little tiny roadside shack shop, cried, nobody spoke English, had to like show them using sign language that my phone had been stolen. They took me to the police. The police like couldn't speak any English either, so I ended up using one of their phones to Google Translate what had happened. Then a random reporter turned up to take a photo, and the police were like, "Don't worry, we're going to find them. We'll find them." 3 hours in the police station later, and I was like, there is no way they're going to find that phone. And also, it wasn't like an expensive phone. It was just that it was useful. And in the end, I was like, tell you what, don't worry about it. I'm fine. Cycled off, found a hotel to stay in that night because I just needed a bit of headspace. I had a spare phone with me anyway. Went and got another SIM card. Everything was back to normal. But then the next couple of days, I started getting like loads of random messages from Indonesians that were like, "Hey Alice, we're really sorry to hear what happened to you, but when you get to this town, you've got someone to stay with because we want to show you that Indonesia isn't a bad country." And it turned out that he'd put my Facebook name on this article this reporter had, And loads of random people have found me on Facebook and then just sent me messages. So as much as it was like a little bit of a bad experience, it was actually a really good experience because it was just like, wow, people are really, really kind.
I was going to ask you if you were wild camping, or how did you find the wild camping? Was it even possible on Java?
I think I did a couple of nights wild camping. I didn't get a good night's sleep because I was quite aware that someone could just walk over and find me, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem because I'm pretty sure nothing bad would have ever happened. But I just didn't like the idea of being disturbed in the night. But I ended up staying in like cheap hotels mainly. And occasionally I'd meet someone, or I used warm showers as well and stayed with some really cool warm showers groups in Java. And they were really amazing. They were really cool. So I think I used warm showers 3 or 4 times when I was in Java, and each time had like a brilliant experience. Because it turns out Indonesians are mega into their cycling, especially cycle touring.
What's the cost of a hotel there?
It was something like, I think it was about £5 a night. It wasn't expensive at all. In my head, I was like, I don't have to worry about finding somewhere to sleep. And for £5, that peace of mind was 100% worth it. And that also meant that I was much better able to plan my days. So I'd go from like town to town because I knew that if I got there, I could find somewhere good to go to bed. So that kind of helped with planning the route in Java. So I was able to like bunny hop between places.
How long did you spend in Sumatra?
I think Sumatra, I was there for about 2-3 weeks. Sumatra was like a world away from Java. So there were much less people. The jungle was really, really dense. The environment wasn't quite as badly damaged. There were still people around, but there just wasn't as many. The roads were a lot quieter. There were still humongous hills. And there were absolutely gorgeous beaches, but there wasn't as much pollution, basically. And didn't find myself being stared at quite as much, which was nice.
What are you eating when you're riding through Indonesia?
I ended up just eating at roadside stalls, like whatever they were selling, I'd eat. So mainly a lot of rice and noodles, and it was something like £1 for a meal. I did have a stove with me, but once I'd considered the fact that it was £1 to eat, I just ended up eating out and just stopping wherever I could. And it always worked out. Like there was always somewhere within like 10, 20 kilometres that I could stop, that I could get food. So that was good. I also ended up drinking quite a lot of Coca-Cola, which probably contributed to the root canal problem.
Probably.
Yeah, but it's like an instant little uplift. It was so good. I think Coca-Cola probably got me through bad times multiple times on that trip. Can of Coke turned out it fixed everything.
I love Coca-Cola, but
I know tastes really good.
But yeah, I never drink it because it almost feels like your teeth are dissolving after you take a swig of it.
This is true. My teeth did feel like they were dissolving, but my mind was instantly healed, so I went for the mind over the teeth in the end. Haven't had to have a root canal since, so that's good. Positive. And if I do need another root canal, I'll definitely be going back to Bali for it.
What happens after Sumatra? You hop a ferry to Singapore?
Yeah, ferry to Singapore. Spent like a week staying with a Swiss family in Singapore. They were amazing. They'd gone cycle touring with their kids. And they had 2 kids that were under the age of 3. And I remember I babysat them one night. And it was the first time that they'd left them with a stranger overnight. That turned out to be quite an experience. I think the pinnacle was the little girl crawled under her parents' bed and wouldn't come out. And she was like crying her eyes out and smashing her fists on the floor. And I had this vision of them coming home to their child stuck under a bed with me trying to pull her out by her legs. And then the little boy also didn't want to go to bed. But by the time the parents got back, they were in sleep in bed. So it made it look like I'd done a good job. And then from there, I went up Malaysia, up coast of Thailand. I went into Myanmar, and then Myanmar, I had to get a flight in the end to Bangladesh because there's no land visa, no land borders that I could go through, which was a bit of a shame. But at the same time, I didn't really mind by that point because I had a friend in Bangladesh that I really wanted to visit.
How'd you enjoy your time cycling through those countries?
Like Malaysia, I was on holiday. Thailand, it was a holiday. Myanmar was quite nice because I'd had 2 months cycling in Malaysia and Thailand and was ready for something a little bit different, but it still was like a holiday. And then Bangladesh was completely and utterly different to anywhere else. It was super intense. I don't think, it was like being a celebrity. I cycled with a friend there called Russ, who's from Bangladesh originally, but he'd lived for 15 years in the UK. So we were friends from the UK, but he'd gone back to Bangladesh to stay with his family in Dhaka for a couple of years. So he cycled with me. And on the way, obviously he could speak Bangla, but because he was with me, people thought that he might not be able to speak Bangla, that maybe he was Indian, because they didn't expect someone who was Bangladeshi to be cycle touring. And he'd be able to hear them like whispering conversations behind us. And they were all thinking like, is that her bodyguard? Like, where do you think she's from? Is she Korean? Maybe she's Chinese. It was just incredible. We attracted like huge groups. We had like 60, we got to one village and about 60, 70 people just came round all to see what we were doing and who we were. I think it was quite intense for Russ because Russ ended up having to answer the same questions over and over and over again about what we were doing.
What was the deal with getting an Indian visa?
The Indian visa. So I went from Bangladesh into India and I didn't know whether I could get an Indian visa in Bangladesh, or even if I could, I was on a bit of a time constraint because Russ could only do so many weeks with me on the bike. So getting the Indian visa in Myanmar was a little bit of a pain because there were just ridiculous rules and it ended up taking a week to process. There was quite a few blogs online that explained how to get it, which were really, really useful because then I was just able to follow what they'd done to the T, and that made my life a lot easier. So like things like they wouldn't accept dollar notes if they had a crease in them. So I knew to turn up with dollar notes that didn't have a crease in them. And in the end, they didn't accept one of the notes anyway because it had a slight tear in it. So then I had to go to a bank and they were only open like 2 hours of the day. So I had to run to a bank to get new dollar notes to come back just in time for them about to close so that I could get the visa processed that day and not have to come back 2-3 days later. But yeah, there was a chance. I did think for a while that it was going to get declined or that they just wouldn't accept like things like I didn't have a flight ticket into India because I was going through a land border with Bangladesh and India. So I thought they might not accept that. So I ended up having to make it up and like buy a fake flight online and then cancel it just so I had a piece of paper that said how I was getting into the country.
So how much time did you spend in India?
India, I was there for literally a week. I've been to India before. Like I've been to India before with a backpack and I'd done about 6 weeks there. I knew that I probably wasn't going to love it for cycle touring. So my main aim when I got from Bangladesh to India was to get to Nepal. So there was just a tiny corridor. I spent a little bit of time in Darjeeling, which was amazing. Loved that area. But my main aim was to get straight to Nepal so I could be in the mountains again. Because by that point, I'd been cycling for like 5 months and hadn't had mountains since Indonesia. So I was ready to be back up high again.
Did you like India when you were backpacking there?
I did. But I was about 22 when I went to India backpacking and it was my first time travelling alone. And people could be quite grabby and quite intense. And there was a big difference between Bangladesh and India when I cycled through. In Bangladesh, people tended to be like really intrigued, but they would give you like a meter personal space. They wouldn't like touch you or anything. Whereas in India, for some reason, like it seems okay to, I don't know, touch my arm, or no one like did anything wrong. It's just that personal space didn't exist quite in the same way that it did in Bangladesh. And I think I did prefer the cycling in Bangladesh to the cycling in India. It felt safer in Bangladesh, actually.
From Dhaka to the Indian border, you, with your friend Russ, you cycle through. You cycle about a week through that corridor in India. Then you make it up into Nepal. You do 700 kilometers in Nepal. And I have in my notes here that you, at one point in time, you ended up with a puncture in the middle of nowhere and ended up staying with a family for 5 nights. Tell me a little about that.
It wasn't a puncture. It was actually like the tyre had split and I didn't have a spare tyre. And I'd been on these, these roads are really bad quality roads. And I'd had to cycle about 200 kilometers on these really bad roads to get to the point where I was away from like proper good roads again. My tyre had split and I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Like the nearest town is like 30 kilometers away. Actually, no, it was more than 30. It was something like 70 kilometers away. And so I'd cycled for a full day and then at the end of the day, this tyre had split. Anyway, started pushing my bike. So I was like, I'll just have to walk, I guess. Pushing my bike. And then I reached this house and there was a family there. And the girl was about 16 years old and she spoke perfect English. Nobody else in the family spoke English. No one else in the village really spoke English, but she spoke perfect English because her parents had chosen to pay for her to go to school in Kathmandu. So when I arrived, I explained the problem. I was like, oh, my bike's broken. And she was like, don't worry, it's like a festival at the moment. So if you want, you can stay with me and my family for a week. So I ended up staying in that village for a week with them and just spending the whole time experiencing what it was like in rural Nepal. So my best friend was like a 16-year-old girl for about a week, which was really cool. And we ended up doing things like making flower garlands together. I watched a pig be stabbed to death so that we could eat it. I ate pig heart cooked in pig's blood for about a week straight, which probably wouldn't recommend, but it was all right. And then there was like the final night celebrations where we went round all the houses and knocked on the doors. And then there was like a big song and a dance. And they were inviting Lucky into their houses to bring good luck and fortune. And they made like little footprints, a bit like how we leave out like cookies and milk for Santa. They put little footprints through the door to make it to like invite the spirits into their house, which was super cool. And I really enjoyed it. After a week of that, so for a week, it was just me and her family. So I had to like use her as like a translator for everyone else. After a week of that, I ended up pushing my bike back to the town, putting my bike on the roof of a bus, going to a bike shop, which turned out to be an absolute godsend, getting a new tyre, and then chose a different route to get to Kathmandu in the end. Because I didn't want to cycle on that same road again, like backtrack another 200 kilometres on the same road.
You cycled into Kathmandu?
Yeah, that was totally fine. I'd heard pretty bad reports, but after cycling in Dhaka, anywhere was good, because Dhaka is the most insane place for traffic ever. So cycling into Kathmandu was not a problem at all.
How was your experience in Kathmandu? Was that your first time in the city?
Yeah, so I'd cycled in, stayed with a warm showers house for a couple of nights. She just ran a 100-kilometre trail race that day and didn't seem tired, which was quite impressive. And then my boyfriend at the time flew out. I did a trek for a week, so went off, did my own trek for a week, and then my boyfriend at the time flew to Kathmandu, and we spent about 3 weeks in Nepal together.
What trek did you do?
I did Langtang by myself, and it's north of Kathmandu. And then me and my boyfriend were meant to do Makali Base Camp, but in the end, I twisted my ankle on the first day, which wasn't a good start. And it was really badly twisted. It swelled up massive. So ended up sleeping in like a hut for the night. And then I couldn't carry on walking because my ankle was too big. Like I could barely walk to the toilet. And he decided, I pretty much said that he should carry on walking because I'd already done a trek and he'd come all that way and it'd be a shame for him to miss out. He carried on walking, but then ended up getting altitude sickness and had to get airlifted, which was pretty intense. So then I'd gone back to Kathmandu with my sore ankle, and the next time I saw him, he was in hospital in Kathmandu, having just been airlifted to the hospital. Probably we didn't have the best luck together in Nepal.
Wow. Did he have insurance to cover that airlift?
Yeah, he was totally fine for insurance, so that was good. He'd actually done a bike ride in China. He'd been like bikepacking in China and Central Asia, and had been cycling like 3,000 meters above sea level, 4,000 meters above sea level there. No problem with altitude. And then for some reason on this trek, it really affected him. And he was only at like 3,500, 400 meters. So it shouldn't have been a problem. And for some reason, his body was not enjoying it that week. And he ended up getting pretty sick. He had like a little device that he could message me off. He could email me on. So I just got an email saying he wasn't very well. So I just said, oh, well, walk back down, then start walking down and you'll feel better once you get lower. And he was like, yeah, I'm not able to do that. Like, I can barely walk to the toilet. And at that point, he decided to get an airlift to the hospital. When he got there, they did like oxygen level checks and stuff. And it turned out that he was really, really quite ill. But the minute he was in Kathmandu, like after a day, he was totally fine again because everything had returned to normal. Whereas I still had a busted ankle.
When you did your trek, did you have to rent any gear?
No, I had everything that I needed with me because I had like my tent, I had walking shoes, I had a backpack, so I had a backpack on the back of my bike the whole time. Like, I had everything that I could possibly need. So that was great.
Was the ankle what ended the trip, or you had to plan when you got to Kathmandu it would be over?
Oh, I'd already planned that when I got back to Kathmandu it would be over because it was then December and I hadn't had Christmas at home for quite a few years. So I was like, yes, I'm going to be home and I'm going to make sure that I get home for Christmas.
What was that like going back for Christmas?
It was really, really nice. It was really nice to see friends and family again after quite a long time. And spent quite a few days walking in the Lake District in the snow. So that was quite a nice introduction back to the UK. And I got to see my cat again. And my cat bit me and scratched me quite a lot, but that didn't matter because I still got to see her.
What's your cat's name?
Cat's name is Maisie, and she is horrible. But she's very pretty, so she makes up for her horrible personality with her beautiful body.
What was your favorite part of cycle touring?
I think it was the fact that you had complete control over your own day. So if you wanted to stop, you could stop. And especially in Australia and New Zealand where you could camp anywhere, if you just wanted to sit and read a book for like 2-3 hours, you could. I think it was just the idea that you had total freedom over your own life. You didn't have anywhere to be. When you woke up in the morning, the only thing you had to worry about was, do I have enough food, water, and how do I get from A to B? The best bit of it is just that you have your own time to yourself again, and you can actually have time to think and contemplate.
Sometime after the trip ends, you end up back in Bangladesh with Russ,
yep.
And this time for a packrafting adventure. How did that idea get started?
When we were cycling in Bangladesh, we ended up cycling like quite close to the rivers sometimes, and we had to cross one of the rivers on a boat with our bikes. And I'd already got a packraft, and I'd done quite a few packrafting trips in New Zealand and Australia. And when we were there, we were like, actually, wouldn't it be amazing to come back and packraft these rivers? At the time, it was like a bit of a pipe dream idea, and maybe it wouldn't actually happen. But then last year, so I'd broken up with my boyfriend again. There's a running theme. And I sent Russ a message and was like, hey, Russ, so I've got nothing planned for like January, February next year. How do you fancy doing a packrafting trip? And he said yes. So we ended up flying out there. We ended up paddling together for a week, and then his boat broke. And then I ended up paddling by myself for about 2.5 weeks after that happened.
What kind of boat do you have?
So I got an alpaca packraft. I think it's the llama. So my packraft is really good. I've since now bought another one because I've realised that if I do packrafting trips and I want another person with me, we should definitely have the same equipment. Whereas Russ had got, I can't even remember what it was called, but it was a pretty cheap version of a packraft, and it was terrible. So I'd brought stuff from the UK with me for him, but I hadn't brought a packraft with me because he'd got this one already. Yeah, that raft was just a bit of a disaster.
You get up in the mornings and you inflate the pack rafts and you set out on the rivers. Well, you're in the dry season, so was there how was the flow of water?
There was no flow. So when we arrived, we knew it was dry season, and quite often some of the rivers that we were going to be on actually dry up. We took like a train up north, then we took like a little tuk-tuk thing to get to where the river is, got out and realised that the water was like knee deep. But luckily, because it's a pack raft, you can actually paddle in knee deep water. So the first couple of days were spent interim paddling versus walking with the boat because there was just no water in the river. And because Russ's raft was so rubbish, he had to literally paddle himself all day, every day, just pushing through this still water. Whereas my pack raft one, my alpaca one, was actually okay in water with no current. It did all right, whereas his was so much work. And before I'd flown out there, he'd actually had a problem with his back and his neck. So for the first day, he wore a neck brace, which was just ridiculous. He had a back brace and a neck brace. And I remember I arrived, he hadn't told me that he'd had this back problem. And he was like, so, small problem. I've got a problem with my neck, and I think I might have to wear a neck brace and a back brace for the whole trip. And then obviously he was paddling really hard, flat water all day, every day. I did offer to swap boats, but he refused. Russ is very stubborn. I'm also very stubborn. So that was an interesting combination. So yeah, he paddled with a neck brace for a while, which was the most ridiculous thing ever.
That is an odd sight. I hope you guys got some good photos of that.
Yeah, we did get some good photos. It was hilarious. If we didn't look odd enough, that just added an extra cherry on top of the cake.
So at the end of the day, whenever you are able to find some water to paddle in down the rivers, are you able to wild camp?
So the first night we wild camped. Turns out, so Bangladesh is the most densely populated country in the world, and there were people everywhere. And because we were moving at barely walking pace, so people would see us from the banks of the river and just follow us as we were paddling along. And because we were paddling so slowly, people could follow us for quite a long time. So by the time it got to night time, it was quite difficult to wild camp because people had seen us all day and could just tell where we were going. So because Russ could speak Bangla, which was really useful, we'd just end up stopping in a village or a town. Russ would then go try find the local politician, and I'd stay with the boats fully inflated while about 50 people stared at me. Russ would go away, try find the local politician, and quite often we ended up staying in local politicians' houses, and they had spare rooms. And we pretended that we were married because we were like, it's probably the best idea because otherwise they're going to feel under pressure to try get us 2 rooms. So in the end, we pretended to be married and just shared rooms the entire time. But it was only a week. We stayed with politicians quite a bit, and also I think I stayed with one of the poorest families I've ever stayed with. And so the river floods every single year. So every single year, these places where we were paddling through, people would lose absolutely everything they owned. Or if they didn't lose it, they had to tie all of their belongings to the roof of their house. Because Russ could speak Bangla, he was able to have these conversations with people and find out what they did in the monsoon season. And it was just absolutely mad. And a bit of you wondered, if it's so difficult every single year, how come you don't move away? But it's just not the same as in the UK and America and places like that, where mobility is quite easy for us, whereas for other people, if that area is all you've ever known and all of your things are there and all of your family and close friends, then moving isn't really an option, especially when money and resources are really, really limited. So people had just got used to it. And every year their house would be 2 feet underwater, and that was just part of life.
How are you navigating? Because aren't there quite a bit of rivers that kind of fork off from one another, tributaries and whatnot? Is it easy to get lost?
The rivers were really wide and there were quite a lot of different branches. One thing was there were quite a lot of fishermen on the river, so Russ would just kind of shout the name of the next town that was kind of along the main branch of the river, and they would point us in the right direction when we were a bit confused, because they were so wide that quite often if you looked around all you could see was water. And obviously because there wasn't really much current, it would be quite easy to get disorientated. I had Google Maps downloaded, the satellite images on my phone, but they were a couple of years old, these sat images, and every year with the flooding of the river changes shape. So quite often I would look on Google Maps and I'd be paddling water, but on Google Maps it would look like I was on a sandbank. There was some problems with that sometimes, but most of the time the easiest way to get by was just to shout at a fisherman and they'd point us in the right direction, because they could probably tell that we were trying to stay on the main river.
Well, what happens after Russ his boat goes kaput and he's done, and then you go on for another couple of weeks?
With navigating?
No, I mean just in general, because now your translator is gone, and
yeah.
So how is it for you alone for the last couple of weeks?
So I ended up camping quite a lot more, which again, there was some interesting experiences there. Trying to find a place to camp where no one knows where you are, especially when there's so many people about. So I'd end up looking on Google Maps and trying to find the place on the river that looked like it didn't have any towns or villages about. And I'd aim for that by the end of the day. But a couple of times I did get found by people. And the good thing was I had Russ on the phone. So phone signal is amazing in Bangladesh. Mobile phone coverage is better in Bangladesh than it is in the UK. So I'd phone Russell if I had a real, I don't know what I'm doing. I'd phone Russ, they'd speak to the local person, and then Russ would go back on the phone to me and explain what's going on. And quite often, when I did get to a town, I'd just go straight to the police station. And sometimes the police spoke English, sometimes they didn't, but they were really helpful. They'd help me find somewhere to stay that night. And usually it was a government hotel or something that I'd end up staying in. So when government workers are travelling between different districts and different towns, they usually stay in their own government hotel, which is really cheap. It's £5 a night. And usually really good. So I ended up staying in them quite a bit through contacts with Russ and contacts with the police. So that was really helpful. And then often I would just turn up in a village and someone would let me stay there in their house, which had both positives and negatives. But there was one place I got to the river, got out my boat, there were loads of people were staring at me. There was nothing really to do around there, so a white girl turning up on an inflatable boat going incredibly slowly was quite a novelty. And a guy came up to me and it turned out that he'd worked in Bahrain for a while, so he did speak some English. And I stayed with him and his family. That night, I slept in one of their spare rooms, and all the way through the night, I kept getting torches shone on my face because people in the village wanted to see where I was sleeping and who I was, because they'd heard about it through word of mouth from their neighbours. So about 3-4 times that night, I woke up with a torch being shone on my face through the mosquito net while people tried to see who I was and what I was doing, which was quite exasperating after a day of paddling flat water, but also completely and utterly understandable that people would be interested because they have literally like, what are you doing here? It was a bit like being an animal in the zoo.
Yeah, that's a little unusual, I guess. We're not used to it here.
Yeah. I mean, when I arrived, he asked if he wanted his wife to bath me. And I was like, no, it's okay. I can bath myself, but thank you for the offer. like I'm okay. I can wash alone if that's all right. And then so they had like a pump in the back of their house and a corrugated metal sheet that you pulled across so that no one could see. So I was having like a bucket bath with this pump and the corrugated iron. And then there was quite a lot of noise from behind the corrugated iron. And I heard him talking. He's like, how much longer are you going to be? Because I don't know whether I can hold them back for much longer. And he had like about 60 people in his front yard all waiting for me to finish this shower so they could see who I was. And I remember thinking like, oh my goodness, there is like no peace and quiet. So I had the world's quickest bath ever because I was just worried about the corrugated iron falling down and everyone seeing me completely naked, which I'd rather that didn't happen. So.
What was your favorite part of the packrafting trip through Bangladesh?
In terms of nature, definitely I saw river dolphins, which was super cool. And I didn't really expect to see river dolphins. I think the first time I saw them, I thought they were just a really big fish. And then after thinking for a little while, I was like, oh my goodness, like that's a dolphin. And also meeting people along the way. I think the biggest challenge was just the sheer amount of people, but also the biggest positive was meeting so many different people and like just being completely immersed in a different country and a different culture. That was, yeah, definitely the best bit. And also I did have some really nice days just aimlessly paddling down a river and then reading a Kindle at lunchtime, which was quite nice.
What were you reading?
I read quite a lot of adventure books. Anna McNuff, she'd just written one about cycle touring around all of the states in America. So I read that one. That one was good. And read quite a few books about trying to be happy, which I think is quite nice. And tried to get as many books by Bangladeshi authors as I could. So I read a couple of books by Bangladeshi authors as well about like life in the villages and life in the cities. Because one thing that was quite interesting about Bangladesh is that the class system there, it's like everyone has a place within society and moving from one bit to the other is really quite difficult. So if you grow up in a village, the likelihood is you will stay in that village for the rest of your life. Or if you grow up in the city in quite a middle-class family, then you're expected to marry into a middle-class family and go to university and get a good job. I think there's quite a lot of societal pressure on people there.
Yeah, we just don't have that here in the US so much, so it's hard to fathom.
Yeah. And like, you didn't see women around that often. So like in the day, women were obviously with the kids back home and they were doing like housework. I remember one day I got off in this village and went for lunch, and I was just eating in like a tiny little side street cafe, and about 50 people all came to watch me eat, which probably wasn't that interesting, but if there's nothing else going on, then maybe it is. And they were all men, but one of the men could speak English. And I remember I was sat there and I was talking to him and I was like, where are all the women? And he's like, oh, all the women are back home, like they're doing stuff. And I was like, all right, how come they're not out the house? Like it was a little bit strange then. And quite a lot of people in Bangladesh were concerned for me because I was a woman by myself, which was nice that they were concerned for me, but also a little bit sad. The idea that maybe it's a lot more difficult growing up as a woman there than it would be in the UK.
You recently returned from a big trip to Iceland. Let's talk about that. So how did the idea for the Iceland trip come about?
When I was packrafting in Bangladesh, I think I had I'd been thinking about doing a trip in Iceland. Originally, I'd wanted to run the length of Iceland, and then I did no training. So I was like, cool, think I'll walk it. I'd read a book by Rosie Swale Pope, which was called Just a Little Run Around the World, and she'd had like a trailer with her. So she'd run around the entire world. I think it took her about 4 years. She had a trailer with her the entire time. And I was like, actually, that's a really good idea. Because I didn't fancy carrying a backpack with 26 days worth of food in it, because that's what I'd estimated it would take me. It ended up taking 21 walking days. So I had a bit of leftover food at the end. But because I had the trailer, I didn't have to do any resupplies whatsoever. So I had this little buggy thing. It was originally a bike trailer for kids. And if you put a special wheel on the front of it, it turns into like a jogger pram. And it was the best thing ever. So I mainly stayed on dirt roads. And then eventually I did leave the buggy behind in a tool shed of the national park and did walk in with a backpack to finish off the trip. And then went back and collected the buggy from the tool shed afterwards. But the buggy was brilliant. It was so good. And if you were going to do a running trip, I think a buggy would be the way to go. But for the walking, it was also completely and utterly, it was so useful because I didn't have to carry anything. All I had to do was push it. And when I was tired, all I had to do was lean forward and my legs moved. So the buggy actually ended up walking me rather than me walking it. So there was a couple of days that were difficult. Like one day was just sand. That was quite hard, pushing the buggy through sand for a whole day. And there was a few days where it was like just rocks. But in total, the buggy, when you were on like dirt roads, it just moved so easily. So if I just put a little pressure on, like if I leant forward a little bit and started walking, the thing would just start rolling by itself. Yeah, it was brilliant.
So your original idea was to run it. So are you a runner? Do you have running experience?
No running experience, but I guess I've got a pair of legs and I've been on a 10K run before. So I reckon if I can do that, then surely you can run the length of a country. But yeah, I decided not to run it because I was like, yeah, I'd not done any training. I'd been super busy with work and just hadn't had the time to put into training at all. And if I was going to do a running trip, then yeah, I probably would want to do a little bit of training. But yeah, that was the original idea. And then once I realised that I just probably wasn't fit enough and probably wouldn't have enjoyed it as much either, then I decided I'd just walk it.
So you fly into Reykjavik, I'm imagining, and then how do you get to the starting point up north?
That was quite difficult. I had to take the buggy on 4 different buses to get to a town where I could then hitchhike for 130 kilometres to get to the starting point of the walk, because I wanted to start at the most far north point I could. So put it on all these random buses. That was quite a lot of work, but they didn't bat an eyelid. Like the Icelandic bus drivers genuinely did not care. So that was good. And then I also had 26 days worth of food with me and like a huge amount of kit. So I'd read all these blogs of like ultralight people who'd walked the length of Iceland and they've got like really, really good gear that weighs like featherweight. And instead I was like, well, if I've got this buggy, I can take what I want. So I'd probably overpacked. And then I had to hitchhike from this relatively small town to the start of the walk, which is the middle of nowhere. I stood there for an hour and nobody stopped because the buggy was up. So I think people thought that I was a really bad mother trying to hitchhike with a child. And then eventually this car stopped and I was like, yes, a car has stopped. And he was like, I work like 5 kilometres up the road if you want to lift for 5 kilometres. And then I was like, actually it's okay because this spot's pretty good. And then he was like, but if you're still here at 6 o'clock at night, you can stay at my house tonight. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. It was 11 a.m. in the morning. And I was like, does he think that it's going to take more than 7 hours for me to get a lift? That was a bit of a concern. Anyway, I put the buggy down and collapsed it and took my bag out and put it on the top. And then this American guy from New York stopped and he was going to a town pretty close to where I started. This town has a population of 120. He ended up taking me all the way to the very beginning of the walk, which was so nice of him. He was a tourist. I think he just liked the idea of helping me out. So I got really lucky and he took me the entire 130 kilometres there.
And then you set up camp for your first night there because at this point getting late?
Yeah, it was getting late. So I walked to the most northerly point, then walked back to the main dirt road and then just pushed for like about 5K and then pulled over and set up my tent. It was really windy that night. And I think I did have thoughts of like, have I bitten off a bit more than I can chew? But found like a little dip because there's nothing in Iceland. Iceland is just barren. Like there were no trees. There's no real shelter. The only shelter is the undulation of the land. So I found like a little dip in the land and put my tent in there and it was fine for the rest of the night. Did absolutely pour it down that evening though. And I learned that my tent is waterproof and my buggy is waterproof. So good lesson to know on the first night.
So how do you plan your route? I mean, are you on like an established trail through the middle of the country, or are you just picking your own route and just walking every day wherever you want?
I had a friend who worked as a guide in Iceland. We'd Skyped a couple of times and he recommended some dirt roads to me. So in the end, I took his advice on which route to take. So I already pretty much knew which route I was taking before I set out. So the first couple of days they were just completely flat and it was farmland. So that was just a random road. I had to push along that for a while. And then eventually it got to like the interior, which is like the volcanic desert. So that was like pure dirt road. Maybe the only people on that road are all going to the same place. It's called Askia. And it's got like a volcanic crater that's quite famous. So any vehicle that went past was just a tourist vehicle. That was cool. And then from there I went to the central there's like a highway that goes through the centre, only it's not a highway. I think when I was there, maybe I'd see about 7 to 10 cars a day. Again, just pushing along that. And then the final bit of the trek, I did a famous trek called the Lauga Vega, which a lot of people do when they get to Iceland. And that was absolutely stunning. But I left the buggy at that point because I couldn't do it with the buggy. Like, it was too steep.
How far are you walking every day?
So I think the most kilometres I did in a day was like 42, 43 kilometres. And average was probably about 33 kilometres. But that wasn't like pushing it at all. You could easily have done much longer days if you wanted to. I just wanted to have a nice time, so I wasn't pushing it. The day when I did 42 kilometres was quite a long day because it was really, really windy and quite cold. And there was quite a lot of river crossings to get through. But there was a remote like hut and campsite that I wanted to get to by the end of the night. So I just decided that I was just going to walk until I got there. And it didn't matter how long it took me, as long as I got there by the evening. And in the end, I got there by 7 o'clock at night. And I'd left at probably like 9 in the morning. So it was quite a good day's walking, really.
Did you ever stay in any of the huts?
No, didn't stay in any huts because they were they're not expensive, but I wanted to either wild camp or pay for a campsite. And every hut has a campsite attached to it. And they're about £13 a night. I'd much rather do that. And I've already got a tent, so I don't really need to stay in a hut. Even if the weather's bad, like, it doesn't matter. But I did go into one of the huts to have a little look round, and they are really, really, really good. But I think you need to book them quite far in advance.
What do they have for amenities?
You get your own bed. They had like a proper kitchen that you could share with people, tables, chairs, proper showers. Facilities-wise, they're perfect. But if you were camping, you had like a shower block usually, and the showers were actually really quite warm, which was nice. And they had a little toilet block and a tap to fill up water, and that was it. But that's all you really need, so I guess that's cool.
What did you find to be the most challenging part of the walk through Iceland?
I had one day that was challenging in terms of the weather. I'd already there was an emergency hut that I'd found, so I did actually stay in a hut for 2 nights, I've just remembered. But it was an emergency hut. You can't book it. It's for only use in emergencies. So I'd stayed there the night and it was really weird, really windy. So I'd had to like take off all the boarding from the windows and the doors to get into the hut in the first place because it had been boarded up for the winter already. And I'd left the big heavy wooden boards outside the door, and in the morning they'd blown like 20, 30 meters away. So I was like, ooh, it's quite bad weather. Anyway, decided that I was going to walk anyway. Started walking and there was just huge sandstorms. And I didn't have any signal, internet signal or phone signal, which was a little bit of a concern because I was like, oh, if anything happens right now, I'm probably in a little bit of a difficult situation. I ended up walking for about maybe like 10 kilometers and my eyes had been streaming. So I'd been walking and the wind had been in my face and my eyes were like, just like little bits of drips. But because the sand was just moving about, it all got stuck on my face wherever I'd had like drips of water from my face. So it looked like I had really, really bad stage makeup on. And eventually I just decided like, oh, screw this. I'm just going to put my tent up and I'm just going to camp for the night. So I just found a really big boulder and camped behind that. But I had to like get huge boulders and build a wall around my tent so my tent wouldn't rip up in the wind. And when I woke up in the morning, those rocks, because they're volcanic and they're quite new, they'd all ripped into my outer fly sheet. So I had quite big holes all around the outside of my fly sheet. But that was better than my tent blowing away. Much better to be safe in a mildly broken tent than halfway along a volcanic desert field rolled up inside a tent because I didn't rock wall it in.
What was your favorite part of the trip?
There was a road that when I'd gone, they had like ranges, and I'd gone to the ranges and I'd been like, oh, I really want to walk this road. And they kind of looked at me like, that's not a good idea. And then asked me a load of questions about like what I was going to do if I was in an emergency. And that road turned out to be the best road of the entire trip. It was the same road with the sandstorm, but that just made it even better because it was a bit more exciting. And it was like 30 kilometers of sand, then just desert landscape. You could see that there's the ice cap in the distance. So the entire day I was walking towards an ice cap, which was amazing. Then you had just pure rocks, and then just massive mountains, ice, volcanic desert around you. And I didn't see another person for 4 whole days, which was brilliant. And that felt remote, like really, really remote. And it was stunning. And there were quite big river crossings. So I think the reason it was my favourite bit is probably because it was the most challenging part of the trip, but also one of the most beautiful parts of the trip.
For people that want to maybe do something like this in Iceland, do you have any recommendations or references for them? Any suggestions?
Get a buggy. No, there's so much information on the internet now that you can kind of just research it yourself. I would just say, just go and do it. Like, as long as you've got enough food and water for the day, you're going to be totally fine. It's not that difficult to plan a route there because there's not that many walking trails and there's not that many roads. So it's actually very easy to plan a route because you've got limited options, unless you want to go completely off path, in which case you need really, really good navigation skills, and you definitely need to take a spot tracker with you. And take all of your food from the UK with you because Iceland is ridiculously expensive. So yeah, don't do your food shopping in Reykjavik. Do your food shopping at home and bring all of your supplies with you.
Let's wrap this up. I had a final question, or there's a few more questions left, but I guess the one final question is, you got somehow into bushcraft instructing, and so tell me a little bit about how that happened and how do you enjoy that?
I was lucky when I got back to the UK. I did a few months of supply teaching as a geography teacher, realised that I still really hate it, and decided that I wanted to still work with young people, but also wanted to work outside. So I found a company that were looking for freelance instructors, and they ran a 2-week training course as part of their process of getting instructors up to speed, and started working for them. So I've done that 2 summers on the run now, and it's mainly like big school groups with you, and you're teaching things like firelighting, trapping, shelter building, how to use a knife correctly. And it is really, really enjoyable. It has some challenges as well, as in you have no personal space and you are free to be woken up throughout the night at any point. But the best bit of it is definitely seeing young people see nature as a resource rather than like a screensaver on their laptop. Because quite often we get a lot of inner city schools, and their experience of nature is literally a pretty picture on Instagram. Whereas instead, and it's quite difficult to get those groups to appreciate nature. So something that I end up doing is getting them to walk around in the woods with me, and they've got to pretend that they're going to take a photo for Instagram or whatever, just so that it's like relatable. And then they've got to come up with their own hashtag for the photo. And that, for some reason, works well as a method to get them appreciating nature, because it's something that they understand rather than just telling them that it's pretty, or like having nights where they just stargaze for 15 minutes. That's pretty special as well. So it's quite nice to see people appreciating nature.
Alice, what's next for you?
Oh, that's really difficult. So I've just started expedition leading, and I'm really hoping that next year involves quite a lot of that. I think I'm taking a group to Machu Picchu in Peru next year, which is really cool and super exciting. But I'd quite like to do another adventure with the buggy, and I'm thinking about potentially running the length of the UK next year. But if I do that, I think I'll do it for charity, because I've not done anything. But so far, all my trips have been purely based just for me. Whereas I think that one is one that I could actually see as a sponsored event, and people like donating money to charity to try and do it. So I will actually have to do some training for that one, I reckon. Or maybe the first day can be a training day.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I would get myself prepared for a run of the length of Britain myself.
Probably. But I mean, I reckon if the first day, if you just like ran jog, then maybe the next day wouldn't be that painful.
Yeah, that actually is it's a good technique, the walk run technique.
Yeah. So if I did that for like the first couple of days, then hopefully the rest of it will be a breeze.
I guess it just depends on what your daily goal is for distance.
Maybe like 40 kilometers, something around that. But then if you've got the whole day to do it, I mean, it depends on how long you want to spend running, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like 40 kilometers if you're running all day could either be a short day or a long day, depending on how fast you're running. So you could actually push it up to like maybe 50 kilometers, but it depends how tired your body gets and how worn out your body gets doing that every day, day in, day out. Because on the walk, I was doing like 40 kilometer days and I wasn't in any pain the next day whatsoever. And I'd not really done any practice before getting there. And my body was totally fine. Probably need to do a little bit of training for it.
You'll probably.
But I don't want. Pardon?
I was going to say you'll probably be fine. Are you still in your 20s?
I'm 29.
Oh, well,
so
yeah.
Next year is the big 30.
You're still pretty young. I think your body can take it.
And I suppose it's more like mind, isn't it?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah. As long as I'm like, well, all I have to do today is get from here to here and not die in the process and run at a pace that I feel comfortable with, then I think that's cool. Especially because the buggy is amazing, so I won't be carrying anything.
Alice, how can people find you online if they want to learn more?
I've got the website, which you said at the beginning, which is alicebowers.com. And then actually, I'm not really on social media at all. So I have my own private Facebook for friends and family. But other than that, it's just the website. So I don't do Instagram. I don't have my own Facebook page. I don't really feel the need to tell everybody about what I'm doing. It would just be the website if you wanted any like little tips or little bits of advice on gear, or if you're thinking of cycling in a country where I've been, then there's a big synopsis about each country that I've cycled in. So there's a little bit of information on packrafting there as well, like some different rivers that I've packraft. So it's mainly if you just want a bit of advice, that would be useful to go on.
Alice Bowers, thank you for coming on the show. Appreciate it. And good luck to you and all your future endeavors, and especially the guide leading thing. That sounds really cool. Best wishes.
Thanks, you too. And thanks for having me. It's been really nice.
Thank you again for listening. You can find this episode online at thepursuitzone.com/TPZ184. That's TPZ184. The best way to support the podcast is to subscribe and share this episode with your friends. You can find subscription links at thepursuitzone.com. Hey, if you're listening on YouTube, be sure to give this a thumbs up. You can also like and follow on Facebook or Twitter. The tag is @thepursuitzone. And as always, if you want to send me some feedback, you can do so at paul@thepursuitzone.com. Or if you want to leave a voice message like Chris, you can do so at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. This episode was recorded on September 30th, 2019. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.